G'day, mate. 40 here. So I was just riding on a bus where the bus driver was going fast and we were hitting every pothole and it felt like he was driving recklessly. And I'll add in the proviso here that I might be a little bit more of a cautious, scaredy cat type of bloke than a real manly adventurer. But I think wherever you are on the political spectrum, you can identify with that feeling of being on a bus that's being driven too fast and too recklessly. And there are no seatbelts on a bus, right? There seem to be relatively few things that you can do to protect yourself in a precarious, dangerous situation. And that is the traditional view of life, right? That's not the Enlightenment, modern, secular, liberal, left, buffered identity, right? This is the traditional view of life that often you are going to be a minnow in a big pond where there are all sorts of waves and forces outside of yourself that are making your existence untenable as you would prefer it. That there are all sorts of forces stronger than you that are flowing through you, that are disrupting and destroying any possibility of you living life as you intend. Right, that is the porous identity, okay, where there are things outside of you that no matter the strength of your defenses, you are becoming vulnerable. So right-wing, traditional, conservative fears tend to be most intense about public life getting out of control, disorder, infection, contagion. Right? These are the primary right-wing fears. Primary left-wing fears are of bigotry and lack of education. And so much to talk about today. Fascinating, the overwhelming elite media reaction to the riots in the United Kingdom is that they are irrational and fed by misinformation. And I have no doubt that many of the pretexts for these riots are based on things that are factually not true, that are misinformation, but that's not the basis for the riots. Or anyway, that is my preferred framing, right? I prefer to look at the world as people did not evolve to be gullible. Therefore, I seek to understand the rational reasons for why large numbers of people act as they do, because you get more interesting results and you become more confronted with reality. And so people are rioting in the United Kingdom because they feel rage, right? They feel that, and then we start to get a rational articulation of that rage. And whether or not the rational articulation of the rage is terribly rational or terribly empirical or terribly philosophical, right? That doesn't make the rage and the emotion behind the behavior more or less, right? Rage and anger and riots are not diminished by being driven by emotion. So I think there are primitive emotions driving these riots. And this is the liberal media consensus about the riots in the United Kingdom, where I agree that there are primitive emotions driving these riots. Where I disagree with the elite and the mainstream media is that I don't think that primitive emotions are inherently inferior to more delicate emotions, more sophisticated emotions, more educated emotions, more reasonable emotions. And I don't think that emotions are inherently inferior reasons for behavior than reason. So the mainstream media is right that there's a lot of right-wing misinformation that was dominant in the early parts of these riots. The perpetrator of the knifing attack was wrongly identified as a Muslim, as an immigrant, when in reality he was not a Muslim, came from a Christian family, and he was born in the United Kingdom. But here are the primitive emotions that are driving the riots. That is, something horrible was done by somebody who is not us. Right? The friend-enemy distinction is sometimes at the core of the political. And when you have someone who does something horrible, like stabbing to death 3 girls and injuring another dozen girls, when someone not us does something horrible, there is usually a much stronger reaction than when it's a member of your own side. And the right-wing tendency is to want to punish more severely people who do horrible things than the left-wing modern Enlightenment sensibility, which believes much more in rehabilitation and understanding. To understand all is to forgive all. Right? That's the modern Enlightenment perspective. And there are valuable insights to be derived from that perspective. In certain situations, that is a superior perspective. So I don't want to opine on whether the riots are a good thing or a bad thing in the United Kingdom right now. I just want to comment on this tendency among elites, among the mainstream media, to immediately dismiss behaviors and preferences when they see them as springing from primitive emotions. And the media and elites did this with regard to Brexit, with regard to the election of Donald Trump, and now with regard to the riots. They had this tendency to immediately dismiss the validity of what's happening, just like Republicans had a tendency to dismiss the legitimacy of Joe Biden's election or victory in 2020 over Donald Trump. Right? It's very easy when you have a particular hero system and then there are events in the world around you that undercut your hero system or damage your hero system, and you want to diminish the legitimacy of those events, right? But that doesn't make you more effective in the world. You're much more effective in the world if you take the perspective people did not evolve to be gullible. So this does not mean that the United Kingdom rioters are on the side of the right and the good and the holy. This does not mean that the Black Lives Matter rioters of 2020 are on the side of the right, the good and the holy. But it does mean that it's useful to look for the rational reasons for why people act the way they do. And so for Black Lives Matter rioters, part of it was a rage at COVID restrictions. And then a lot of it was rage at Republican government. And then a lot of it was rage at people with a particular hero system and a particular identity that was so intense that they had a strong victimhood identity, right? You cannot have a strong in-group identity without a strong victimhood identity. And so people with this strong victimhood identity got activated by the death of George Floyd, and they then launched out into riots, right, to defend their hero system, to have fun, to rage against a machine that they saw as rigged against them. And so even if they were wrong on rational, moral, philosophical bases, even if the upshot of the Black Lives Matter rioting was terrible, for example, for the black community, with a vast increase in murder rates, right? Tens of thousands of black people have died as a result of Black Lives Matter rioting because you gave police a rational incentive to back off on policing, so you had more reckless behavior that led to a vast increase in death, in particular for black people, right? But it's just intellectually lazy to dismiss behavior that you don't like as irrational, primitive, and primitive, therefore it can be dismissed, right? There's a great deal to learn from these riots in the United Kingdom, right? There's a sense, as I understand it, that there's a two-tier policing system, a two-tier governing system in the United Kingdom that works against the interests of the people who are participating in the riots. And people do have a sense of who is one of us and who is not one of us. And this is partly shaped by race, but it's not solely shaped by race. Right, so, for example, a black Englishman who articulates and sympathizes with the causes of these riots, who is outraged at the insane high levels of immigration into the country, who is outraged at the Black Lives Matter movement, all right, there would be many people on the right who would regard this exceptional, courageous black man as one of us, right? So people with a strong European or Christian identity may have negative feelings about Jews as a group, but when they see an individual Jew, for example, expressing some empathy and sympathy for their point of view, they may well think, oh, this is our Jew. You know, he at least on this issue is one of us. Identity is often primitive, not fully based in philosophy. Right? Nationalism, for example, is seemingly irrational emotion that you just feel that this particular nation, this particular people that you're a part of, that it's superior to others and you love and care about it more. Right? That's not for philosophical reasons, just that this is my extended family. You don't tend to love your children for philosophical reasons, right? You love your children because they issued from you and that you have devoted so much to them, right? You've cared for them, you've protected them, you've looked after them, and you've invested so much in them. The more you invest in someone, right, the more likely you are to care and love them. So it just seems like the mainstream media has learned nothing from Brexit, from Trump's 2016 victory, and resurgent right-wing populism all around the globe. They just want to dismiss it as irrational and primitive. And that's the dominant reaction. Now, some more sophisticated, thoughtful people on the left want to understand it and don't just immediately dismiss it as irrational. Elizabeth Warren, for example, has some populist economic policies that many populists on the right could embrace, such as ensuring mortgage forms that are shorter, easier to understand, creating less room for mortgage lenders to manipulate and trick people, right? We could, whether we're on the left or the right, we could agree we need to do more for people with below average levels of intelligence to make navigating through life easier, and making government forms and government bureaucracies like easier to deal with. But stunning that the Democrats have chosen Tim Walz, the Minnesota governor, as their vice presidential nominee. Right, so prior to this pick, I had Kamala Harris for the previous 2 weeks with a 40% chance of winning the presidency. So right now, after this pick, I would reduce her chances to, say, 33%. Right? I saw some reporting that primary reason for this Kamala Harris election, if indeed it was Kamala, God damn it, I'm trying to cross the street and someone just like stops in front of you. Like, what the hell, man? So I saw chyrons on Fox News suggesting the primary reason for Kamala Harris's pick is that she was insecure about being outshone by Josh Shapiro. Right, that's my read of Kamala Harris, that her personality is most starkly revealed by her insecurity, and this hypothesis of mine seems to have enormous explanatory and predictive value. And if you've got a hypothesis that has explanatory and predictive value, you've got a pretty good hypothesis. So Kamala Harris is staying on script during this campaign because in her insecurity, when she's off script, she sounds bizarre, she freezes up, she tends to be quite unimpressive. Someone who is highly insecure, right, is going to be highly reluctant to choose a running mate who might outshine her. And so instead, she chooses a guy who's a dud, right? Who's, I think he's only 2 years older than her, but he looks 20 years older than her. I just, he is anti-charisma. He is unimpressive, right? He is weak in all the areas where Josh Shapiro is strong. Like, Josh Shapiro does an amazing job answering questions, articulating MAGA concerns, working across the aisle on a bipartisan basis. He has a lot of respect from Republicans. You can't say any of those things about Tim Walz. Her insecurity has driven her to choose someone who is so dull that she can feel confident by comparison with him. And I can have some empathy for this, right? I have dated hot women, and I have dated homely women, right? So there have been a number of homely women who I've dated who I nevertheless found attractive, usually because I've gotten to know them for a sufficient length of time that they'd become transformed in my eyes. So just initially looking at them, very few people would say this woman's hot. But as I got to know her, got to know the whole package, then she became attractive to me. But she was homely, and I didn't have to work as hard to maintain her fidelity and to keep her in the relationship, right? As compared with when I was dating hot women, and I'd take them to a party, and many of the guys were hitting on her. Like, many of my best friends would hit on the hot women that I was dating. They couldn't help themselves, and often like august men, like men with great accomplishments who'd published critically reviewed books, people in very high standing in their profession would send her emails along the lines of, I hope I'm not coming across as just another creepy old man hitting on you. I had friends who would try to fuck my girlfriend, and they would use anything that I might have confided with them to try to destroy my relationship with her. And I didn't end the friendships. I recognize that for many of us, when the penis stands up, the brain leaves. Right? A stiff prick has no conscience. I had to work harder to keep my relationships with hotter looking women. So too, Kamala Harris faces less competition now for the media spotlight, and she is going to less frequently have to confront her own insecurity. So when you run away from your character defects, such as insecurity or cowardice, or you don't want to do something, so you keep putting it off, right? There is an endorphin rush when you get to escape a dangerous situation, such as for Kamala Harris being outshone. But then you are more deeply encoding in your neuro reward system more and more incentives to behave in this maladaptive manner. So when you get an endorphin rush from putting off a dangerous or confronting or difficult task, right, you make your tendency to put things off stronger. And so when you avoid reality to try to cover up for your insecurity, as Kamala Harris does, right, she is just making herself weaker. And the other stunning thing is that Josh Shapiro is obviously the superior candidate, and in large part he wasn't chosen because he's Jewish. What's the difference between professionals and amateurs? Professionals predict. Men with clanking balls. So it's also stunning that the on the face of it, the best candidate for the Democrats to win this election wasn't chosen, in large part because he's Jewish, and there's tremendous anti-Jewish animus in the Democratic Party right now. And this is not inherent to being on the left. It's not inherent to being a Democrat that you just hate Jews. But we're in an extraordinary situation where Israel, the Jewish state, is in its longest running war ever. And it seems to be on the verge of fighting a war on many fronts. And the international elite consensus, particularly the human rights consensus and the United Nations consensus, is strongly against Israel. And much of the domestic elite consensus is more strongly against Israel now than it has ever been. And so given these particular conditions, where the plight of the Palestinians is felt instinctively by people on the left along the lines of Lenin's narrative that the fight against white European imperialism justifies any tactic, and in response, very few tactics are allowed to Europeans to defend themselves. So from a left-wing perspective, Israel is a European imperialist state that is driven by unworthy colonialist motives, and therefore any tactic by oppressed peoples who have inferior technology to rise up against Israel is allowed, while Israel must be highly constrained in its responses to terrorism. And Tim Walz is selected, the governor of Minnesota. This is amazing. This is a guy behind Black Lives Matter, supportive of Black Lives Matter, mostly peaceful protests, who saw much of urban Minnesota burn and be convulsed and have astronomical crime rates. So Great Britain 100 years ago had the same low crime rates as Japan. Right? 100 years ago, Great Britain had very low crime rates. And now we've had a steady rise in crime in the United Kingdom, but also true for much of the United States. All right, in the San Fernando Valley, right, you could leave your car unlocked until the 1960s. Right, in West Los Angeles, you could leave your car unlocked until the 1960s. And in the United States and in the United Kingdom, we've had a dramatic increase in crime since the 1960s. Along with this growing perception by the majority of the population that there's a two-tiered police system that tends to work in favor of the groups with the highest crime rates and against the groups who have the lowest crime rates. And Kamala Harris has a varied record. She's been all over the place in matters of law and order. But when she ran for president, she ran on the most extreme left platform possible within the Democratic Party. And now she has gone back on virtually everything that she stood for during her campaign to win the Democratic nomination. But I can't imagine the selection of Tim Walz and his support for Black Lives Matter is going to rebound to her benefit. It's going to bring a temporary comfort in that he looks so old that he's not going to be a galvanizing, charismatic figure who outshines her. But then I predict within a week, her standing in the polls is going to start to drop. So for 2 weeks, she enjoyed a honeymoon with the news media. And now that honeymoon is over because there are a number of Jews and people who are sympathetic to the Jewish state who are going to recognize that Josh Shapiro was not chosen in large part because he was Jewish, and that there is a substantial part of the Democratic Party with great skepticism and animus towards Jews and the Jewish state. And Jews are only about 5 million in the United States population, but they donate about 75% of Democratic Party funding. And some of those funds are going to get cut off. And you're going to get the first critical articles about Kamala Harris within the next week. due to her selection of Tim Walz, because just the facts on the ground seem so obvious that Josh Shapiro would be better for the political fortunes of the Democratic Party, but he couldn't be picked for the sake of Kamala Harris's insecurity, that her delicate feelings could not handle the best pick for her party. And so for the first time, we see her decision-making getting scrutinized. This is the first major decision she's had to make since rising to the top of the party. And how much do we think that she made this decision? Right? How decisive was Kamala Harris's vote? How much was this a decision by elites in the Democratic Party looking to protect Kamala Harris's insecurity? Mark Halperin talked on Sunday about fear among Democratic elites that Kamala Harris and her husband Doug Emhoff had never been properly vetted. Laura Loomis says there are a lot more scandals coming our way with regard to Doug Emhoff. That a month ago, Democratic elites did not think that Kamala Harris had the right stuff to be president of the United States. That Joe Biden, Barack Obama, many other important figures in the Democratic Party were not convinced that she had the right stuff to lead the Democratic Party to victory. And now, will this pick of Tim Walz strengthen these doubts about Kamala Harris? And the Republicans have not been particularly sharp in their attacks on Kamala Harris. Does this result for the first time the Trump campaign is not up to snuff? Is this the first example of confusion, imprecision, sloppiness, lack of discipline on the part of the Trump campaign? Or what is really going on is that the Trump campaign is holding its fire until after the Democratic convention, after the Democrats formally nominate Kamala Harris as their candidate for president of the United States. And then you get the release of damaging information, because you just have to look into her track record as sketched out in Peter Schweizer's book on corruption that came out in 2020. There's an entire chapter devoted to Kamala Harris. And she has a consistent track record of not prosecuting people who are contributors, who are friends of the machine that's supporting her, who are valuable clients to her husband, Doug Emhoff, who are tied in with the Willie Brown machine. For example, Kamala Harris did not prosecute one predator priest. Her predecessor at San Francisco District Attorney prosecuted many predator priests. Kamala Harris did not prosecute one, because you had the Roman Catholic Church tied in to the Willie Brown organization. So we haven't yet seen any serious journalistic scrutiny of Kamala Harris. I mean, she has been riding this 2-week honeymoon, and now, for the first time, I suspect we're going to get some serious scrutiny of Kamala Harris, because this pick of Tim Walz against Josh Shapiro will be the opening that shows how she makes decisions. Like, why has she never been able to hold on to her staff? Why has there always been low morale in her staff? Right? Why has she always presided over a chaotic organization? Whenever she's been leading an organization, whether it's running for president or as California Attorney General or a San Francisco District Attorney, why has there always been chaos in her organization? And it comes back to her and her insecurity. And when you're insecure, you don't want to be outshone, and so you don't bring in the best people, right? People who would ensure that you have a more effective, efficient operation, who would do what they can to improve morale. But we're getting more and more stories in the undernews about how badly Kamala Harris has treated the people who work for her. And these are people who went in filled with enthusiasm for her, right? They went to work because they're excited about having a black woman in a position of power, and how virtually all of them became disillusioned with her, often rather quickly, and grew to hate her. It is telling that no one has stayed by her side for long, aside from her sister. Normally, you bring a team along with you. Right? Kamala Harris, when she became vice president, she had a team assigned to her because the Biden administration knew that she was terrible at management, and they just assigned her a team. Assigned her a team during the campaign, and now again the Democratic elites have assigned Kamala Harris a team. Right? She doesn't have many people with her now on this presidential campaign that she has a long positive history with. But instead, there are all these outside elites being brought in to take over as much of the decision-making for Kamala Harris as possible. And you have many veteran political observers, such as Mickey Kaus, noting this is the first time we have a political candidate from a major political party for president of the United States where you have no sense that they are really running things. Right? Ronald Reagan, right? He chose the people who had long-term loyalty to him, and for however much Ronald Reagan was disconnected, it was still, you knew that this was his team, his campaign, his priorities, and this has been true for every major party nominee until now. Right? There's nothing about this Kamala Harris campaign that has the distinctive mark of Kamala Harris on it. Right? It's entirely an alien operation. It's been brought in to run her. Have I seen Braveheart? Yes. Seen it several times. Powerful movie. Some very funny tweets about what's going on in the United Kingdom. One tweet where you have all these Muslims driving out a Sky News reporter and saying very impolite things. And the header is, "Never meet your heroes." So you see reality breaking through on X. Yeah, there's a lot of crap on X. There's some disinformation, misinformation on X. But from the accounts that I follow, right, you consistently get a sense of the reality that you would not get if you're just following the polite news media.